Okay, folks, one of the big problems that people seem to be having with the textbook questions is units. You have to remember that there are standard units. And unfortunately, the textbook likes to make you do all kinds of conversions. So, for velocities, standard units is meters per second, but you'll often see kilometers per hour in the book, which means we have to learn how to convert those into meters per second. Okay. Accelerations, meters per second squared. Okay, let's do the first one. Let's work with the v first, and then we can talk about accelerations. So let's say you have kilometers per hour, which we'll write like this, and we want that to become meters per second. So there's two ways you can go about this. You can use a unit cancellation method to determine what the factor will be, or you can figure out the factor itself and just use that factor as a multiplication or division. So I'm going to take a question. Let's say we have, a question has 30 kilometers per hour. And we need to make that meters per second to use it as a v in our formula. Okay, so we start and we write like this: 30 kilometers per hour as a fraction, right? Because that's what it means. Now, we're just going to change the tops and the bottoms of the fraction. So we're going to do two conversions, one for the top and one for the bottom. Now, when you do a conversion, the whole point is that you're actually going to multiply by 1. The value of your conversion factor is always 1, so it doesn't actually change anything when you multiply by 1, right? So we're going to multiply this by something that's going to be a fraction, and it's going to equal 1. But the way we're going to do it is we're going to look at the kilometers, right? We're going to change the kilometers. What we want it to become, we put on top. We want this to turn into meters. And what we want to get rid of, or what it was, we put on the bottom. Because then when you multiply, you can imagine that the kilometers will cancel, right? But we have to make this conversion factor equal to 1. So we have to remember that 1 kilometer is exactly the same as 1,000 meters. So there's a fraction, and it equals 1, because at the top and the bottom are really the same thing. They're just using different units. Okay. So now, what does that give us? Let's do the multiplication. 30 times 1,000 is 30,000 meters. And look what happens to the kilometers. They cancel out, or we're dividing kilometers by kilometers. So we're left with meters on the top and hours on the bottom. So now we have meters per hour. So we're halfway there. We've changed the kilometers to meters. Now we'll do the same thing for the bottom. We'll take our 30,000 meters per hour that we had up at the top. We'll multiply it by something that equals 1. Now the hours are on the bottom, right? What do we want to turn those hours into? What do we want on the bottom of our fraction? We want it to be seconds, meters per second. So now I'll put the seconds where I want them, on the bottom. And then on the top, I have to put the thing I'm trying to change. So they're opposites. You see, the h's are on opposite sides because I want to eliminate the h's. I don't want hours anywhere in my unit. Now, 1 hour is the same as, well, there's 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour, so 3,600 seconds in an hour. So there's another conversion factor. The top and the bottom are actually the same thing. They're both an hour of time, but one's measured as hours and one's measured as seconds. And we do the same thing. We have to take the top of the fraction, which is 30,000, times 1, but the hours are going to disappear. So all that's left on top is meters. And then on the bottom, we have 3,600 seconds. So notice our unit now, right here, let me move that up a little bit. Our unit has become meters per second. All we have to do now is deal with the numbers. And so to do that, we just have to take 30,000 and divide it by 3,600. So just do that on the calculator, and we get 8.3. So now we know that it's 8.3 meters per second. So that's how you do it. Now, what you can do, of course, is you can do both steps as in one. This is the conversion factor that got rid of the kilometers, and this is the conversion factor that got rid of the hours. So let me do the exact same thing in all one step, okay? All one step. 30 kilometers per hour. So my first conversion factor, I multiply by, I want to get rid of the kilometers, so I put the kilometers on the bottom. Okay, and I put the hours on top. Sorry, not the hours, the meters on top. And I put the 1,000 meters, because that's the same as 1 kilometer. Now I'm going to do the second conversion factor without even figuring that out. I'm going to put the other one to deal with the bottom. I'm going to put the hours on top, because it's opposite, and put the seconds on the bottom. Put 1 hour, 3,600. So you can see I'm just using both of those things in the boxes right here all at once. And then I'm going to figure it out. So on the top, it's 30 times 1,000 times 1, which is the 30,000. And these kilometers and those kilometers will cancel. And these hours will cancel, leaving me with the meters on top. And then on the bottom, it's just 1 times 3,600. So you see I get the same thing all in one step. And that still works out to 8.3 meters per second. So that's how you can do it. And that's the way they like to do it in chemistry. If you're taking chemistry, when you're changing like moles and grams and things, this is how they like to do it. But in physics, we like to do it a sort of a different way. What we do in physics is we say, well, that's great for 30 kilometers an hour, but what if I have 20 kilometers an hour? What if I have some other kilometers an hour? So what we do is we come up with a conversion factor by using just, that'll work for everything essentially. So we take, okay, let's take kilometers per hour. And let's not say we have a number. Let's just change kilometers per hour into meters per second. Well, the way we would do it is by multiplying by the conversion factor, and we would do meters and kilometers, just like before, 1,000 meters, 1 kilometer, and then we can change the bottom, change the hours, seconds, 1 hour, 3,600. Now we don't have any number out in front here. We're just doing this for the unit itself. And what we find is that this works out to 1,000 over 3.6. So it's 1 over 3.6. These cancel, meters per second. So what is 1 over 3.6? Well, it means dividing by. 1 over means dividing by. So we figured out that if you want to change a number from kilometers per hour and turn it into meters per second, all you do is divide by 3.6. Let's try it with our, what was it, 20 kilometers per hour that we had used before? Let me go back, 30. Let's try it with our 30. So we take 30. Okay. Lost my pen here. Give me a second. Not sure what happened there, but we take 30 kilometers per hour. And we just divide it by 3.6. And guess what you get? 30 divided by 3.6. And you get the same 8.3. 8.3 meters per second. So there's our conversion factor. Kilometers per hour, turning them into meters per second, divide by 3.6. And that works for them all. Now, what about multiplying? Or what about going backwards? Well, obviously, the opposite would work. If you ever wanted to take meters per second and turn them into kilometers per hour, you'd do the opposite. You'd multiply by 3.6. But we hardly ever do that because usually we're after this, right? The standard unit. So there's two ways you can change units. One is to sort of plotting out every time doing the unit cancellations, or you can figure out the conversion factor first, and you can write this on your formula sheet. It's a conversion factor, so this statement you can write on your formula sheet, okay, in case you need it. Okay, now it's a little bit harder going from meters per second to kilometers per hour squared and per second squared and all those things. So now I'll go through that process with acceleration. For acceleration, we want meters per second squared. You have to remember that's the same as meters per second per second. So there's 3 parts to an acceleration unit. There's a distance part, a time part, and a time part. And they can all be different. So you could have kilometers for the distance part and hours per hour, which we would write as kilometers per hour squared. But doesn't have to be the same time unit. You could have kilometers per hour per second, which you can't write this way. It doesn't work. Now what does that mean? Remember what acceleration means. It means that your velocity is changing by a certain amount every second. This one means that your velocity, well, let's say it was 8 for fun, means your velocity is going 8 kilometers an hour faster every hour. 8 kilometers an hour faster every hour. Whereas if it was 8 on the bottom, it would mean that you're going 8 kilometers an hour faster every second. So this is harder to convert. Okay, so if we have the first instance, let's say we had 8 kilometers per hour per second, right? Well, you could rewrite that as 8 kilometers per hour per second. Now we already know how to change this part. Kilometers per hour into meters per second is our factor of 3.6. We divide by 3.6, right? So if we take the 8 and we divide it by 3.6, we get 2.2-ish meters per second per second. And that's all we have to do, because 2.2 meters per second is the same as 2.2 meters per second squared. There. We just had to change the kilometers per hour part, because we already had seconds as the last part of that unit. Now what if you have kilometers per hour squared, which your textbook sometimes does? Well, here's what we have to do. We have to rewrite that as kilometers per hour. I'll do it the long way first. Okay? And then you have to do your conversion factor. Okay, let's get rid of the kilometers. So we put meters on top, kilometers on the bottom. That part's easy. 1 meter, sorry, that's not right, 1,000 meters, that says 1,000, is equal to 1 kilometer. Okay, good. Now what about the bottom? The conversion factor for the bottom is going to be a little different. We're not getting rid of hours, we're getting rid of hours squared. And we're going to try to turn that into seconds squared. Okay, let's think about this for a minute. Hours squared is hours times hours. And so what we have to basically do is we have to square our entire factor. See, seconds times seconds is seconds squared. So if we were just going hours to seconds, we would write this. We would write 1 hour on top and seconds on the bottom, and we would write 1 hour is 3,600 seconds, right? But we're not doing that. We're doing the squares. So we have to square the top. 1 squared, hours squared, equals 3,600 squared, seconds squared. Okay, I don't know why I wrote seconds twice over there. I shouldn't have. Okay, so we're actually not dividing by 3,600. If I go back up to here to fill that in, I'm going to use this one because I've squared the numbers because the units were squared. Okay, so I'm going to write that again. Kilometers per hour squared. I'm multiplying by, first we were doing the meters and the kilometers. I'm just rewriting what we had written before. Now my new factor is hours squared. So I'm writing in hours squared and meters squared. Well, there's 1 seconds, my mistake. Sorry, folks. Still kind of early in the morning here. Seconds, right? Not meters. Did I do that up above too? It's quite possible I did. Nope, I had seconds up above. Now I wrote a 2. There we go. Hours and seconds squared, right? Both time units. So normally we would write 1 hour has 3,600 seconds, but because we're doing the squares, it's 1 squared and 3,600 squared. There's our new conversion factor. That's all. So now when we do it, we do the top and then we do the bottom. Okay, so the top would be 1,000 times 1 squared. But the hours squared here will cancel with the hours squared there. So I'll have 1,000 and all I'll have left is meters. But on the bottom, I'll have these kilometers and these kilometers canceling out. I'll have 3,600 squared seconds squared. And if you do that division, you're going to get a very small number, right? A very small number. 1,000 divided by 3,600 squared is 0.00077 meters per second squared. So that's like a conversion factor, okay? So let's do the one in the textbook, 19C. Well, actually, you know what? I'm going to save that. I'm going to put that solution on the section of homework help that I have at the end of the unit. So at the end of your unit, you're going to find a module that says questions or solutions to questions, homework questions. And I'll make videos of each of the ones that people ask. So if you look on page 144, question 19, this is in chapter 4, the Newton's laws questions, Newton's laws of motion. You can see that the first two have meters per second squared, but then C and D have these weird units. So I'll put that up as an answer for 19. There's a few other questions in there as well that I'm going to address. So watch for those videos. But this is how you do conversion factors. And out of all this, what you should probably do is you should go back to here and you should write down this thing right here so you know how to change from kilometers per hour to meters per second. And then down here at the bottom, we have basically we've done a conversion factor here. Now I realize that we did it a slightly different form. So let me go back to here and let me just rewrite this. Let me just rewrite this in a different form. Okay. Pen. Okay, so what we have here really is 1,000 over 3,600 multiplied by 3,600. Okay, so I'm going to divide top and bottom. Divide the top and bottom by 1,000. 1 over, how do you divide this by 1,000, this bottom? Well, remember, dividing by 1,000 is like wiping out 3 zeros. So I'll just go 1, 2, 3, and I have 36 times 360. So I can just do it like that, because I've wiped out 3 zeros. And that becomes 12,960. And of course, if you did that division, you'd get the number we had before, the 0.000077. It's crazy, small number. Meters per second squared. And what does this mean? It means that if you want to go from kilometers per hour squared, and you want to turn that into meters per second squared, you divide by 12,960, and that's your factor. You can write that on your formula sheet as well as a conversion if you want. Divide by 12,960 to make that change.